director of ITSS Verona, and I'm also a lecturer at King's College London. So ITSS Verona is, for those who have just joined us, is an apolitical and not-for-profit association that focuses on international security, broadly conceived. So from traditional to very non-traditional security issues. It counts about 60 active members and interns, and has a scientific committee of about 100 scholars and analysts from all over the world. So at ITSS Verona, we aspire to be as inclusive as possible, not just in the traditional meaning of this word, but also with regard to academic perspectives. And so we have launched at the start of this academic year, this series, a webinar series called The View From. The first event of this series was a few months ago about Brazil, and this one, the second one, is about Southeast Asia. The idea behind The View From, behind this webinar series, is that instead of trying to bring together to our webinars different ideas and different colleagues, and hopefully both, who can represent different regions of the world that go beyond that Anglo-American geopolitical region, which tends to be dominant. Let's face it, in our field of studies, in international security. I work in a British institution myself. And so we think this inclusive approach is not just about human or professional inclusiveness, but is also to better illustrate, to better describe, to better study a world order that is in a transition. There are a lot of questions throughout this historical transition, but I think what is sure, for sure, is that we don't live anymore in a world where there is one or two countries or block of countries that influence world affairs. It seems to me that every region has nowadays, in different ways, is having an impact in shaping this transition. And certainly today we're talking about Southeast Asia, and one might argue it's probably the most, it will probably be the most consequential regions. The trends within this region might be the most consequential, the most important ones. So we think this conversation and this series, more in general, are very much timely. So with no further delay, I want to introduce the chair of this event, who is Arslan Skeikh, who is, of course, a member of ITSS Verona, and is also an MA candidate at the Defense Studies Department of King's College London, where I'm also teaching. He did his previous postgraduate studies focusing mainly on modern history of South Asia at JMI in New Delhi. And his research interests include areas of international security, transboundary water cooperation, and conflict resolution. Before handing it over to Arslan, though, I just want to apologize for the absence of Arnaud Sobrero, another member of ITSS Verona. He's currently ill, but actually I know Arslan and Arnaud worked very hard to organize this webinar. So I'm very grateful to him as well, and I hope he gets better very soon. Arslan, I will hand it over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Zeno. Thanks a lot for introducing this webinar series, and me, of course. Those are very kind words. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Arslan Masood Sheikh. This webinar is the second event of the View From webinar series by ITSS Verona. There have been different world orders since the advent of state. These world orders are structures that are a result of great power competition among different major powerful states who try to gain as much advantage as they can with their economic and military might to seek to reform the world order, primarily suiting their own diverse interests. This new webinar series aims to democratize the debate of great power competition by bringing together the experts from different parts of the world and discussing how today's great power competition between USA and China is affecting their region's geopolitics, geostrategy, military, and economics. Today, we will be discussing the impact of this great power competition on Southeast Asian region and countries with and countries will shed some light on how these states are strategically positioning themselves to manage their relationship with both powers. The webinar will include the discussions on a wide range of topics such as political and military positioning, the impact of the Quad dialogue in the region, the South China Sea dispute, and military procurement in the face of stronger military containment policy. The webinar will also discuss the relevance of ASEAN in these changing strategic alliances. To shed some critical insights on these issues, we today have two very important and eminent experts with us. Our first speaker of the discussion panel today would be Richard Bidzinger. Richard is a visiting senior fellow with the Military Transformations Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies and TU Singapore. His work focuses on security and defense issues relating to the Asia-Pacific region, including military modernization and force transformation, regional defense industries, and local armaments production and weapons proliferation. Mr. Bidzinger has written several monographs and book chapters, and his articles have appeared in various reputed journals such as International Security, the Journal of Strategic Studies, China Quarterly, and among others. He is the author of Towards a Brave New Arms Industry, Come to the Revolution, Transforming the Asia's Pacific Militaries, Transforming the US Military Implications of the Asia Pacific, and I can go on and on, but I'm really sorry due to the time constraint. I will move further, but it is pertinent to mention that he's also the author of The Modern Defense Industry, Political, Economic, and Technological Issues. Mr. Bidzinger was previously an associate professor with the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Hawaii, and has also worked for the R&D Corporation, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Affairs, and the United States government. Our second speaker for the day would be Fitri Bintang Timur. Fitri is a researcher at the Department of Politics and International Relations, Center for Strategic and International Studies, also known as CSIS. Broadly, her research focus includes defense and security in Asia Pacific, women in peace and security, non-traditional security, as well as Indonesian politics and foreign policy. She specializes in women's participation in international peacekeeping operations. She has held research and visiting positions at the Philosophy and Political Science Faculty, Technical University of Dortmund in Germany, and also at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU Singapore, Center for Asian Studies, and TU de Manila University in Philippines. She has taught security and defense management, gender and security, and research methodology at Indonesian Defense University, Parahyang Catholic University, Paramadina University, and Bina Nusantara University. She's a part of Indonesia Security Sector Reform Working Group with Institute of Defense, Security and Peace Studies, and together with Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, published the Almanac on Human Rights in Indonesia. Richard and Fitri, thanks a lot for joining us today. We are very honored and obliged to welcome you both on this webinar. We would also like to welcome everyone here with us who could join us today. Please note that this event is being recorded, so people who don't want to be seen on screen, they can turn off their cameras. Also, please keep your microphones on mute unless you are to speak. So the webinar will follow general pattern. First, we will start the discussion with both our speakers, which will be followed with the Q&A session. So without taking too much time, which I already have, I would start the discussion with Richard. Richard, Southeast Asia is turning out to be a hotbed of US-China power competition. It is strategically and economically a very important region in the world, and states in this part of the world which have grouped themselves together in the form of ASEAN to promote economic and political security and cooperation have also got mired in this power competition between USA and China. Over the years, ASEAN has established various regional structures such as Asian Regional Forum and East Asia Summit, which allow it to engage and manage their relations with different major powers. The US, which has a strong interest in preventing China from controlling the South China Sea, has responded by continuing military cooperation with Asian members, including the Philippines and Vietnam, and increasing its maritime presence to enforce the freedom of navigation in international waters. So The influence of power of Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN has been limited by lack of strategic vision. It can be deduced from apparent deviating priorities or interests among member states, particularly regarding China's claims in the South China Sea. China's resurgence as a major military and economic power in this region is not only likely to transform the relations of Asian states vis-a-vis China and USA, but could have a serious impact on the internal relations among Asian member states itself. So what, according to you, do you think would be the strategic implications of this power competition for Southeast Asian nations? Richard.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to chat here today with you. And it's also a real pleasure to see a colleague that I shared some time with back in Singapore many years ago, Fitri. It's great to see you again. Um, what can we say? There's an old line that we like to use here in the West, which is called torn from today's headlines. And indeed, when we look at what's going on in the South China Sea, it almost literally is. There's a major naval operations that are going on in the South China Sea involving the United States and some of its allies. You may have read about this crash of a F-35 off of one of the U.S. aircraft carriers, and now, of course, there's a race to recover the wreckage and things like this. And I think this sort of underlines the fact that the South China Sea will continue for a long time to be an area of competition and hopefully not conflict. Another thing I've often said about Southeast Asia is it is both a zone of peace and a zone of conflict. Um, to tackle the latter first, we see a lot of tensions and a lot of potential things going on. Certainly, the standoff in the South China Sea, and not just between superpowers, but between powers regional within the area. Um, the interesting thing you might say about the Southeast Asia is that we might be surprised that there isn't more conflict. That this seems to be an area where, well, since at least 1979 and the Sino-Vietnamese War, we haven't really had a major outbreak of hostilities. Now, every day is like a new day, and we kind of hope that that's going to continue. But I think it's very interesting that we continue to monitor this area, and yet we should perhaps marvel at the fact that we don't have as much as we think we might when it comes to competition and particularly out and out clashes and conflicts. And that's interesting because again, there probably isn't a part of the earth where the neighbors on each side, or rather, how do I want to put it, the neighboring countries within ASEAN are very different from each other in so many ways, ethno-linguistically and economically and everything like that. And yet they are able to find mechanisms by which to cooperate with each other. And I think what thing that really ties the nations of Southeast Asia together is, of course, their desire to basically minimize the impact of great power conflicts on their regions and on their individual governments. That being said, of course, one of the real tragedies in a sense is Southeast Asia, and particularly the South China Sea, is in effect a little too valuable or too important to great powers that they will be left alone. And in particular, we can see this being played out almost every day in the South China Sea. I mean, this is an area where when I first came to Singapore about 15 years ago, there was a feeling that the situation in the South China Sea, if not solved, had at least been put on the back burner. And everybody agreed to disagree and also agreed not to raise tensions in the region. And now, unfortunately, over the last decade, there has actually been a ratcheting up of problems. Now, you can pin that all on China, and certainly China bears I think, the brunt of responsibility for raising the stakes and therefore raising the tension in Southeast Asia. particularly its efforts to build these new artificial islands and then to militarize them and to increase its military presence, as some people have pointed out to me, both by militarizing the Spratly Islands in the eastern part of the South China Sea and then building up its military forces in places like Hainan and Woody Island in the western part of the South China Sea to expand the naval maritime activities, particularly the creation of a new unified Coast Guard. And all of these things are basically working in common to try and make a reality the declarations that the Chinese have made about the South China Sea, where it is an area in which China exerts, as they like to call it, indisputable sovereignty. And whatever that means, I mean, your mind can sort of go and make those extensions that essentially China wants to basically be the first among equals, the primus inter pares, when it comes to deciding security in the South China Sea. And that would slowly, I think, extend their outright control and sovereignty and ownership of the South China Sea as much as they can. And of course, other countries, particularly the United States, but also Japan, I'd say India and Australia, and even I think many Southeast Asian states, of course, combat that idea in various ways and are trying to keep South China Sea a open waterway. And there's a variety of ways of doing this. Some have been more successful than others. But what I think the impact is, and you mentioned this in your opening lines, is this has led to a militarization of the region. And in fact, one of my common themes that I have gone on in my writings is if we look at how many of the states in Southeast Asia have responded over the last couple of decades, we have seen a pretty ambitious rearming and arming programs going on. The acquisitions of much better types of weapons, much more modern, and as I like to say, more capable. The new types of weapons that have been sort of going into the region, things like fourth generation or fourth generation plus aircraft or submarines or improved and larger types of surface combatants. All of these are placing in Southeast Asia in capabilities that they didn't have back in the 90s or indeed maybe even in the early 2000s. So the militaries are not necessarily getting too much bigger, but they are getting more capable. And what does that mean? Well, you could say it's an arms race. I think that it doesn't carry the same potentially apocalyptic visions that arms races do. But on the other hand, it does not help the smooth or tensions or reduce the state of potential violence in the region. And certainly if there was some conflict that was going to break out, it would be a lot more cataclysmic than it was before, simply because of the capabilities there. Compounding this is the fact that these nations in general are becoming wealthier and therefore can afford these things. It's also the fact that many of these countries are trying to develop their own arms industries, and so a lot of their procurement is to be able to support local arms industries, varying degrees of success in that area. But I think we see this as one more thing in the mix. And so what are we facing here? I mean, we're obviously facing the fact that the Sino-American strategic competition is deepening. We've seen more animosity between the two great powers. And it's sort of like, where is this going to play out? And for better or for worse, it's basically the South China Sea and probably also secondarily in the Taiwan Strait, that we're seeing these types of competitions really gel and sadly worsen. What's going to be the ultimate outcome? Well, I don't know at this point. I mean, you were hoping that we can keep these competitions to a, but you know, the typical academics punt is to say only time will tell. With that, I'm going to conclude my opening remarks and turn it back over to Arslan.
Thank you, Richard. Well, you are quite right about that deepening animosity and the ambitious arms race, whether it is a race or not, but still going on and creating concerns in this part of the world, and also the raising capabilities, as you mentioned. So I would like to get back you on some points on this, but first, following the pattern of this webinar, I would turn to Fitri now. Fitri, a very warm welcome to the webinar. The ASEAN has always projected its role as an important regional player and has developed an Asian-centric approach to regional security through the concept of Asian centrality, with the growing China's military and economic prowess, which has itself raised some doubts about the Asian centrality approach. So my question to you would be, how would you assess the relevancy of this Asian centrality concept and its strengths and weaknesses? And is there a unity in Asian member states approach regarding dealing with this power competition between USA and China? How do you see this concept and its relevance? Fitri.
Thank you so much, Arslan, for your deep thought question. Thank you for having me. My name is Fitri. I'm a researcher at the CSIS Indonesia. So mostly I would offer the perspective from Indonesia, of Indonesia. Indonesia is the founder of the Association of Southeast Asian Nation. It's founded 1967, more than 50 years ago. And if I may to ask the slide to actually show you where is ASEAN. And
just a moment, sure.
Thank you. Because I'm quite conscious to have my face in the screen while talking, so I like to have the presentation to
can you guys see it?
From my eyes
on screen?
So yes, thanks so much. It's just to show where is ASEAN and what are the countries there that bond together and agree to go on the ASEAN way. One country, one vote. We don't do voting. We do. We have a consensus. That is the ASEAN way. All of these 10 countries are the country that are post-colonial, saying that what does this mean? They are very, they defend so much their sovereignty. They don't want to be under any big power rule anymore as they were before. So they maintain their sovereignty. They don't do internal interference, and they don't discuss the issues directly. They go around and discuss issues in a time that is suitable to all. So if there is an issue that is too contentious, ASEAN, the 10 countries decided to not discuss it yet. We're gonna discuss it when the time is ripe and settled. This is how the ASEAN has managed to be a peace dealer, maker in the region in a way that it managed to solve its issue. Like, for example, how does Myanmar being persuaded to go into democratic transition in 2012, for example. How in the early 1990s, does Cambodia under the Pol Pot regime have managed to go through the system and managed to have its security sector reform, for example. It is not ideal, and how the Indonesia solved its issue with Timor-Leste, for example, and the Mindanao Peace Treaty that actually invites the observer of ASEAN countries to see whether the peace agreement between the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in the Philippines with the government of Philippines are done well, following their agreement with the presence of the observer of Indonesia and Malaysia, for example, to see whether the peace agreement went well. So the ASEAN as the country that have concern between them as well, because of the nature of a post-colonial countries, the border in this area are drawn by the colonial power, and the way the colonial power, they used to leave and they left the border in contentions between the countries. So between these 10 countries, they have border issues that are unresolved. Indonesia still have issues with Vietnam, with Malaysia. Indonesia and Singapore just managed to solve its flight information region, signed the agreement yesterday, for example, that actually deals with the Singapore military training area that under the Malaysia Peninsula, as you can see, that little dot is Singapore, and that just being signed off yesterday. So between this country, there also border tension. But having ASEAN established in 1967, it create a bowl or condition conducive, if I may say, that tension between these 10 countries would not erupt, and allowing the peaceful discussion and talk to be resolved through the mechanism that was being said, through ASEAN discussion, ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting, ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting Plus, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East ASEAN Summit, as well the ASEAN Maritime Forum. And now I want to answer the sort of a long answer to the question: how does the US and China great power competition play in the region? Of course, we know based on the globe on the left, it's China is closer to ASEAN. If we want to be fearful, we usually fear our neighbor. The US is quite a bit far, but I know how the US power projection is, and I give you the statistic of the defense budget that the two big countries spend, and how it allowed them to procure the most modern technology, be it the traditional warfare, submarine, mothership, combat aircraft, so on and so forth, as well as patrol ship, for example, that trespass the waterways, as we know in the 9 Dash Line. That is claimed by China, are being also claimed by Vietnam, Malaysia, a little bit Brunei, and Philippines as well. And Indonesia is trying to be the honest broker, not saying that Indonesia is a claimant to Southeast Asia, to the South China Sea, but it tries to be an honest broker, although it still have a little bit of its North Natuna Sea zone of exclusive economic zone that being claimed by China, and we have this kind of every month of the year have kind of a standoff between the ship, the fishermen, the Chinese fishermen, also with the survey boat, with the Chinese patrol guard being face to face with Indonesia. Bakamla or Sea Patrol, and then the Navy come, and then the president come with the ship, and then it's just a show of power to show that we are serious in defending our sovereignty. But because of the ASEAN being there, and there's 10 countries in ASEAN, our position in the ASEAN is we choose not to side on one great power, and actually not to assert which country, whether we side to the US or to China. We don't, as an ASEAN, we would like to be able to have the say that we are 10 countries, and although we're heavily dependent of the foreign direct investment, almost all the 10 countries, except for Singapore, probably a developing country, and we're competing for investment, but we don't choose to side with the US and China. Of course, that would that would be different with when it comes to term with the pressure. When China pressure, of course, countries that is closer to China, for example, the Myanmar are being seen, and Cambodia, and perhaps Laos to an extent, are being seen that they are under pressure of the influence of China, for example. And what does this mean? Maybe they don't really like to have a term that the US use, like the Indo-Pacific. That was the term that being used by the Quad, where the US was grouping with India, Japan, and Australia a couple of years ago under the Trump administration. Now the Biden administration have this, or the Biden or Obama version 2.0 have its AUKUS, the Australia, UK, and US grouping, and of course Southeast Asia, the ASEAN don't want to claim that as well. But Indonesia, we like to be the leader. We like to take back the name. For example, the Indo-Pacific should not be a term that being used by the US as well. So Indonesia put up the term of the ASEAN outlook of the Indo-Pacific, and have this round of negotiation, having the ASEAN countries to say that we want the ASEAN outlook of Indo-Pacific that is inclusive, that was previously being used by the US to guard, to fence China out. We wanted to make inclusive, and we include China as well in the ASEAN outlook of Indo-Pacific in our connectivity. But if we can go to the next slide, maybe I take too much of my time to talk. The next slide would show more about
no, Fitri, you are totally right on time. You have time, and in just a bit, I think the second slide should be there.
Yes, the next slide is just a statistic on how much this country, the 10 country are.
Is it there?
Yes, in terms of the defense budget, and you can see the head-to-head. Of course, the defense budget is from Fitri, and how the population are different. So the population of Brunei, for example, is only 500,000 people, which is different with Indonesia. There is 270 million people, and this it creates a different kind of insecurity and security strategic and dynamic. And China, of course, with the population and growing defense budget, is still not, if you say, in comparison with how much US are spending. And if we combine ASEAN, although ASEAN never actually have its own, saying that we're an alliance, and we kind of put all together our defense budget and capability together, we still no match for this two country. What we have, the 10 country have is only our sovereignty, and therefore we want to engage with the great power in a way that we don't choose which country we align to. We don't choose we don't say that we choose any country in preference, and we maintain our centrality with our lesson learned and expectation. So we learn from the responding of COVID-19. Of course, there's China did the vaccine diplomacy way, winning the heart and mind, but still we don't say that we're siding with China, for example, because the ASEAN still have tension in the South China Sea. And on the second issue is the pending code of conduct for the South China Sea that has been discussed for over like 2 decades. So the code of conduct of South China Sea have been agreed. Only the framework or the outline in the situation right now, we still have the negotiation pending because the countries, the ASEAN countries would want to have a face-to-face meeting that was hampered by COVID. And China have its stance of wanting to have the code of conduct is between ASEAN countries with only China. But ASEAN country would want the code of conduct of the South China Sea is for every country that want to go in the water of the South China Sea to abide of the code of conduct of the South China Sea. That is still being discussed, and hopefully under the Cambodia chairmanship. We know that the chairmanship in ASEAN, the way we do leadership is because of the 10 countries, all countries are considered equal. We have this kind of a rotating chairmanship based on alphabetical order. In 2022, this year is Cambodia's chairmanship. It's the turn of Cambodia chairmanship. And we still have the not nightmare, but the trauma, because in the previous Cambodia chairmanship in 2012, there's a deadlock where the ASEAN failed to agree of the joint communique. The first time ever ASEAN failed to agree joint communique, because it was the first time ASEAN discussed the issue of South China Sea, and not all the country in ASEAN would agree to discuss South China Sea. And hopefully Cambodia learned from 10 years ago, and now it will manage better in terms of how it discuss the issue of South China Sea in its joint communique. As well, in the Cambodia chairmanship, there's issue on the Myanmar, and we know Myanmar can be sort of the proxy of the great power competition as well. How China are being, it said its arm, its weapon are being, I'm sorry, my English is not good, but trafficked in that area, and we have concern of the terrorism as well, crossing between the Mindanao and Myanmar, and the Myanmar crisis has been an issue particularly concerning for ASEAN because it was we don't want to have the siege of Marawi as it was happened in the Philippines a couple of years ago, sort of 5 years ago. So in the Cambodia chairmanship, we kind of hope to solve this Myanmar crisis without having to have this involvement of the great power competition projecting in Myanmar. And of course, as you see how the GDP per capita is quite different in the 10 ASEAN countries, we're still competing for foreign direct investment. And we know that somehow the economic issues can be an underlying factor of allowing entry of certain ports, giving passage to certain countries. So of course, there's always a test of how can the ASEAN be united despite their competition among each other, despite their different in terms of welfare and how they manage centrality. And if they don't have the unity, because they're so different, whether they can still maintain their centrality among this great power competition. It is time will test it. And I guess I talk too much, and by that I return the screen to Arslan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fitri. That was really very detailed background of ASEAN and the process through which it makes decisions, and also what this region aspires to be. I mean, not wanting to engage or align to any particular major power, but if there are pressures, so as you see, we have to see how this will pan out. So I think that was really great talk on Asian centrality concept and how this unity will help the centrality of this approach. So moving forward, I would now like to open the floor for Q&A sessions. So if somebody wants to put forth their questions, they can. Yes. Yeah, Esther is raising her hand. Esther.
Well, thank you so much. These talks were brilliant, and I find this super interesting. And I was hoping, because we've been talking about sort of local perspectives and trying to not necessarily involve or raise tensions due to great power competition in an area that's already subject to it to such a degree. How do you see the role of ASEAN evolving and expanding in sort of the management of these tensions, and what kind of leadership role? Because ASEAN is a brilliant or very interesting case of an international organization with its internal tensions, but managing quite a lot. So I wonder how you both might see that leadership position going forward in mitigating or potentially exacerbating or reacting to these kinds of tensions.
Sorry, Esther. Yeah, go on, please.
I think Fitri should probably take the lead on that, being that she's probably a lot more in tune with what ASEAN is doing.
Sorry, there was a phone call. Yes, thank you, Esther, for your question. I don't think, how do I say, ASEAN have its own mechanism. It creates an architecture where countries can come together and have this discussion. To be honest, ASEAN has been successful in managing a meeting between great powers better than Indonesia, for example, because Indonesia is trying to create Bali Democracy Forum, but US decided not to come, and then we kind of put China to be the first speaker, and everybody was like, what? China is not even democracy. But in ASEAN architecture, we managed to have this kind of discussion with the ASEAN Plus mechanism, in which that we engage ASEAN as 10 countries, discuss ASEAN plus one, ASEAN plus the US plus China, and then later on we kind of meet them together in terms of the ASEAN regional forum that cover the whole the Asia Pacific region. And that we have the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting plus, and that would include defense ministers from the ASEAN countries. And through the ASEAN Defense Minister meeting, we have this mechanism to create, for example, the discussion of the hotline. For example, if there's a tension, to prevent a further escalation, what are the hotline and what kind of the communication channel that should be open? So for example, for each defense ministry can call and then diffuse the tension. So at least despite they clashes may happen, the decision to go to war would be prevented in a way. So I think the way ASEAN leads as well, the big country of ASEAN, because just like European Union, perhaps not all countries are the same. In ASEAN, they're like leading countries power, like Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, you can say Philippines and Thailand are the bigger country, and they would to an extent lead. And for example, this big country, I think they are still in the same pace of saying like, we're not going to choose between the US and China, at least not openly, and they kind of say it publicly over and over again. So that's why when we put our face forward, the ASEAN is still maintained as a cohesive. I hope I can answer you. Maybe I answered in an Asian way, not direct. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I guess Michele has raised his hand. Michele?
Yeah, thank you, Arslan, and thank you very much, Richard and Fitri, for two very interesting presentations, full of content, really full of food for thought. Richard, I actually have a question for you. Drawing on what you said, you made a very interesting remark at some point, which was something along the lines, it's kind of surprising that in such a big area, full, ripe with strategic implications, with strategic relevance, we are not really seeing that much conflict, right? So since the scene of Vietnamese War, so many years ago. Drawing on this, may I ask you, do you think this is going to actually change in the near future? And if you were to, I know it's a very big question, but I really would like to pick your brains on it. If you were to sit down in Brussels in front of the EU leaders, what would be your personal recommendations to the European Union vis-a-vis this big area? Thank you.
Okay, that's very interesting because a constructivist approach to regional security would emphasize something like ASEAN and the fact that ASEAN at least creates an architecture for conflict, maybe not conflict resolution, but conflict avoidance. And I do think that you could make some claim there. More of a realist approach, which is me, is that for the most part, there hasn't been conflict because I don't think there's been, maybe up until very recently, the kinds of stakes or goals in the region that have forced countries to, use force or the threat of force in order to get what they want. I mean, there's been a lot of conflicting claims over the South China Sea, mostly economic. But they haven't reached that level where we're prepared to go to war in order to meet our achieve our goals. At least maybe not until now. And the problem with the argument that so far so good, we haven't had a major conflict is you can't use that to predict the future. I think over the long term. If I were in the EU and I were giving them advice as to how to approach the South China Sea issue at this point, I would probably counsel a certain amount of caution and patience, which frankly is what the EU is kind of all about, I think. So it's not very hard for them. But I think we have to be aware of the fact that, status quos only stay a status quo if everybody involved wants it to be. And I don't think I'm betraying my Americanness when I point out the fact that I think China is very much trying to change many of the fundamental bases for security in the far western Pacific along the lines of it meeting its interest. And, that's what nations do. But then all the other nations have to figure out whether or not this is to their advantage or not. And I think more and more, China's biggest problem is they're creating their own, counter reactions by essentially a rather heavy-handed way that they're going about doing it. In a sense, we've already seen that if they're not dragging the EU as an entity into taking more of a stand against, say, China, certainly a lot of individual nations within the EU have decided on their own to take perhaps more defiant approaches towards what they might see as Chinese assertiveness or efforts to change the status quo that affects not just simply the far Western Pacific, Southeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific, and so on, but actually could eventually come into Europe's own territory. And in particular, we see this in the way that the Chinese are trying to punish some of the Baltic states, supposedly for opening up a little bit more to Taiwan. And I the EU is still trying to figure out how you not be a doormat and how you still nevertheless are able to reap the benefits, which are considerable, by doing business with China. I'd say at this point, if I was the EU, I'd simply be watching the situation, but I'd be preparing that you might have to work more in the security realm in order to do this kind of stuff.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you, Michele, for good, very interesting question, and Richard for such an elaborate answer. We have a question in the chat. Yes, it's from Arnaud, and I quote him. Well, I guess his question is for everyone. He hasn't mentioned. In September, I quote, in September last year, we had the announcement of AUKUS framework, a UK-US AUKUS framework agreement designed to provide submarine nuclear propulsion related technologies to Australia from USA/UK. This pact has had geopolitical seismic effect on the international stage. Couple of questions. He's asking how AUKUS will impact ASEAN with the context of great power competition, especially in South China Sea. So I guess this is for Richard, if I'm just assuming. And second question, given the various reactions from Asian countries, to what extent AUKUS could be considered as a reflection of a lack of unity of Asia? So I guess this is for Fitri. So Richard, if you could go first on his question, that how AUKUS will impact ASEAN within the context of this great power competition.
Well, I mean, I think honestly, when we look at AUKUS and we look at ASEAN, I mean, I don't really think that there is yet a kind of an impact. I mean, at this point, AUKUS is very much a tripartite agreement between three powers, and mostly Western. And it's very limited at this point. I think a lot of people extrapolate out that this is a potential new type of security alliance. It could be, maybe it should be, but I think this is still very much being worked out. And keep in mind too, most of this is surrounding one particular activity, which is the provision of nuclear submarines or nuclear submarine technology to the Australians, and it could easily fall apart. Efforts in the past to sell submarines, or particularly nuclear-powered submarines, for example, to the Canadians back in the late 80s, early 90s, got all the way up to the altar and then was dropped. Of course, the French know that the Australians dropped this large effort to sell a dozen submarines to the Australians, and it could happen again. I mean, it depends on the cost and it depends on the technological barrier. So I think we shouldn't be extrapolating out the AUKUS too much. Now, that in the sense, if we do want to sort of let the narrative carry us along, we could say that AUKUS, perhaps along with something like the Quad, which also brings in India and Japan, do these all sort of mean something like the reemergence of the old SEATO Pact, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, something that the United States tried back in the 60s and of course fell apart. If these things are done, obviously what they do is they raise pressures on ASEAN with its fundamental effort, which is basically to be left alone. And you know, you sort of face this problem of like a country like you know, Belgium in 1914 or Poland in 1939, which is all the best efforts that you can make to be left alone in great power conflict doesn't mean anything if your geography gets in the way. At this point, I think that we shouldn't over analyze or over extrapolate these things, but that doesn't mean that down the road we could find these developments putting more and more pressure on ASEAN countries.
Thank you, Richard. And I guess we will take the final question because it's closing to almost an hour. And thanks, Arnaud, for this question. Glad you are watching it. So, Fitri, if you could get a response from you on how, given the various reactions from Asian countries, to what extent AUKUS could be considered as a reflection of the lack of unity among Asian member states?
Thank you for the question, Arnaud. I think you're healthy enough to engage with us. So I don't see that AUKUS is a reflection of the lack of unity of ASEAN. It is, on the contrary, the comment from the ASEAN countries has been to remind countries joining AUKUS on the ASEAN agreement. So ASEAN have the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation that also been, you know, agreed or respected as well by China and the US as a way of engaging with the 10 countries of ASEAN, as well as ASEAN to deal with the Cold War, the first Cold War to say. The ASEAN has what it called agreement called Zone of Peace and Neutrality, where it agrees that the area of ASEAN would not accept a nuclear, arms. So that said, this procurement by Australia with the nuclear-powered submarine has received quite a contention by countries of Southeast Asia, saying that we didn't discuss whether nuclear powered is considered as the nuclear arms. But please respect that we have this agreement to the region already signed in 1971. So if you want to bring that submarine in this waterway, you might not be able to do so. And actually, because of AUKUS, it actually brings a lot of interest from European Union. For example, the French defense minister actually come to CSIS office to have a talk on French strategy on Indo-Pacific, trying to win win ASEAN countries. From the US or say. So I guess I think I overtake my time, so I return it to Arslan. I hope I answered.
Thank you, Fitri. This discussion was getting really interesting with passing time, but unfortunately we had to call it a day because of our time limit as prescribed earlier. So I thank you, our special guests, Richard and Fitri, for agreeing to join our discussion today. It was really very lovely and honored to have you on this panel. So thanks a lot, and thank you, Michele and Zeno, for this organizing these wonderful discussions. So with that
Thank you,
said,
Arslan. Thank you, Richard and Fitri. Thanks a lot. It was great to listen to you.
Thank you.
Hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much to also all our guests, Richard, Fitriani. We are immensely honored, I mean, to have you. Apologies for not being probably so many. A lot of us are working and something like this, but we are recording this, so we're gonna circulate this, and I'm sure that this is going to stir debate and enhance knowledge, add other layers of analysis, which, and as Zeno was saying previously, do not solely gravitate around the Western-centric vision. It's so very important to have opinions also from the area. So again, from the bottom of our hearts, huge thanks. Stay safe, and we will obviously be in touch very soon. Everyone, thank you again, and see you next time to another ITSS Verona webinar series. Take care all. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.